Well, we're continuing with our sand fluffer build today, and I thought I'd show you where we're at. We've been working on the main shaft here. Now we've got our adapter collar up here, or our universal joint. It's there. It slides up a little bit farther when it's actually done. I still have to go over and drill and tap my 2 holes for set screws to lock it into the keyway. And we've built a matching half that will mount right here with our belting in between, and I've got 4 pieces of belting that we're going to put in there. It's the same design as this one, with the exception of I've threaded the inside of this. And it's threaded 3/4 16, and it was kind of an arbitrary thread size, although it's worked out perfect. I think it's the proper setup for this. But one of the main reasons I chose 3/4 16 is I had a tap that was a spiral tap, rather than just a straight 4-flute tap. The thinking behind that is we're going to have to, after we cut our keyway, we're going to have to chase the threads in there just to take off any little burrs. Is going to make it easier. And a spiral tap, once you get it started, will span across that keyway. So if you're using a standard 4-flute tap, you'll start tapping it and it'll hang in that keyway every time around, and you'll end up either oval or else you'll break your tap. You won't be able to chase those threads, whatever the case may be. So anyway, I chose 3/4 16. It's worked out fine. So the shaft I've taken, and the original plan, as I explained last time through, was to take this upper bearing assembly. It will be mounted someplace in this area, and obviously this is not going to work. It's going to have to be spaced out, you know, our cross angle here, so we've got room for our shaft to go back through. But for demonstration purposes and layout, this is what we've done. So our other half of our little universal joint connector, whatever we want to call it, will mount on top, and our shaft will go up through. Now, I have threaded this for about 3 1/4, 3 1/2 inches, something like that, enough to where I can get it as close as I can to this. And once this is threaded in place, well, before we thread this in place, of course, this was the shaft that I had before that came out of my original sand muller. So this portion of the shaft was turned to 1 inch, or approximately 1 inch, to accept the wheel bearings that we're going to reuse. Now, when I went back and remachined this, of course, we threw it off center a little bit. We had a kind of a sliding fit on here with our bearing. It was a pretty tight fit, but this shaft was turned rough. It was, you know, done quite some time ago and probably was not my best work. So what I did when I first started off was I cut off this section on the top where our keyway originally was in this. This extended another probably 2 inches, 2 1/2 inches, and it had a keyway cut in it. So I shortened that up, and we put centers back in both ends. That way I can turn it basically between centers, and we're going to hold concentricity. I can take it out of the lathe, I can put it back in, and we're still going to maintain that. So since I still have to machine the bottom, I felt that was important to be able to maintain concentricity with it. So when I turned it, we were probably a little bit not exactly centered when we had this area. Plus, when I polished this a little bit, why, it was a loose fit. And I'd originally thought that I would just knurl that enough to take up that space, but I didn't really like the fit I got there when I had it in the lathe. So what I've done is I just turned that section down, and there again, kind of an arbitrary diameter, just something, and I built a little bushing that will slide on the top, and this is too long, it'll get fitted. But anyway, it's a tight press fit on there, a light press fit. I'm going to go ahead and press it on. I'm going to take it over to the TIG welder, and I'm going to put 2 fairly substantial TIG tacks on there with the TIG welder just to hold it in place, make sure it doesn't move, and then I'm going to machine it to the diameter for our bearing, and we'll shorten up this shoulder to where it's proper length. We only need about 6/10 of an inch rather than a full 1 1/8, 1 1/4, whatever we've got here. So that'll go on there. Now I will go back and we'll be cutting a keyway in the top part of this, of the threads here on the top, because what will happen is this will thread on, and there again we'll drill and tap this for a couple of set screws on the side, just like we are the upper half. We'll figure out where this is going to be, so our shaft is just shy of level there, and then we'll figure out where that's going to be. We'll cut a keyway in the shaft itself and install a key in there. So that will maintain that in position. It will have no chance of moving. Now this shaft is way overkill for what we're wanting to do with this, but there again, products at hand, so that's what we're going to use. So this will be our bearing area, and we'll adjust this where it needs to be. Now this portion of the collar will slide up another 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch. But I won't do the final fit on that until we get it drilled and tapped, and probably powder coat that. We'll probably clean up these components and paint it. We want it to look nice while we're doing. Once that's in there, that will set up there. Our bearing will ride on this surface in here, and we can figure out where that spacing is. And from there, we'll figure out where our bottom bearing is going to sit. Once we've done that and got alignment, we'll go ahead and machine the shaft to accept our bottom bearings. And I still think I'm probably going to use both of those bearings. I will take my little spinner assembly, or the mixing portion of this, is going to sit farther up on the shaft here, and our bearing assembly will sit down lower on the bottom portion of that. So we'll probably machine it to where our spinner assembly will slide up against the shoulder, and there again we'll cut a keyway in it to lock it in place. Probably not necessary, but we could probably do it just with a couple of grub screws. But while we're doing all this fancy machining, we'll cut a slight keyway, cut a shoulder, make it butt up there, install a keyway in that, so that will slide up and lock in place. Then up against that we can do the top portion of our bearing assembly, just like this bearing here, and we'll use the bottom of that spinner assembly as the contact point for the top of that bearing, and that'll set where the bearing sits. Then we'll thread the bottom just like we've done the top, and do a threaded collar or a couple threaded collars to act as jam nuts. Either way probably, or maybe both, just to be sure, since we've got all that weight and motion happening there. And then we'll mount our bearing assembly, and that's how we can set our preload on our bearings on the bottom, is through those nuts or collar, whatever we choose to put on there. So that'll once we get that done, we'll drill both the top and the bottom mountings. However we figured out whatever assemblies we've got, we're probably going to have to do a block spacer off of both sides to get this out far enough for our shaft to protrude through. And I think we want to do the same thing on the back side. We'll do something to where that angle iron is filled, and we've got a spacer out there, so we've got positioning both front and back. And we're just going to bolt them, I think, on both sides. We'll use nuts and bolts, lock nuts on them, or nylocks on them to hold them in position so they don't come loose. And once we get that done, then we can finish up the niceties. Then we'll go back, do our shroud and our handle, and start our wiring and that type of thing. So that's where we're at. I've came across an old mud flap that was kicking around here. I've cut it up. I've got 4 thicknesses, or we can use up to 4 thicknesses of that I've already cut for our universal joint here. And there's enough of that to have the rubber shroud around the bottom to maintain our sand and keep it from eating away there. I built my little universal joint to go up on top here, and this is what we've got. Now our upper, you saw me make that, or you saw the final product of that for the top half, and it was just bored to match the shaft here. This had a keyway in it, so we'd cut on the shape of the keyway. That was in the previous video. So then I turned another for the lower half of this universal joint, I guess we'll call it, and it's pretty much the same as this, except it's threaded on the bottom side, and it's going to thread to match this shaft here. And we've cut a keyway in here, so the way these go together is they will thread together like that. Got a keyway both halves, so when we get them down to final alignment, we'll install the keyway, install our 2 set screws in here, and then that has virtually no chance of moving there. Now for the universal joint itself, I had originally had 4 layers of this belting in here, and they were cut from an old mud flap, which is what I scrounged up here in the spirit of this junk sand fluffer from using whatever we have, and it had a couple of ribs in it. So the other 2 layers had a step on one side of them, and it didn't line it up very well. Plus I think it might have been too stiff. So we've backed it down just to these 2 layers, and of course these will have nylocks on them when they're done, so they can't come loose. But anyway, there's the upper assembly. The way this is going to go together is our universal joint's going to go on. Now I've already mocked up where this first bearing is going to sit, and this is its approximate location. Now I've discovered that to get the front on there, I had to space my angle iron off 1.25 inches, and I've done that on both sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and just take some square tubing that I've got junk square tubing along that same spirit of the junk sand fluffer. And I'm going to just take and weld a small piece on each side. Then we'll take and drill it and bolt it, so we can bolt it to our centers. And we're going to do it top and bottom. I'm going to use the identical setup here, and then we'll take another piece of angle iron and mount on here to support the back, so that we're supported level front to back. And these will be identical top and bottom, so they'll, well, virtually identical. It's the same process for both ends. Now, I was originally going to use the full cartridge that I had for these with a bearing top and bottom down on the bottom. I've kind of rethought that, and I think I'm just going to use one more section of this, or probably the other half of this one, and we'll just flip it upside down, and that's how we'll set our spacing on them and our preload on our bearings. And I think that'll work fine. I think it'll do everything it's supposed to do. Let me slide this back together and see if we can't get this universal joint back up on here. This is tight the way it sits, so we get our bearing out of the way, and we'll line it up with our keyway here, and it slides right up into place, right where it's going to go. Let's just tighten it down so that it doesn't decide to go any place on us when we start adding the weight of the shaft and everything else that fits on here. So hopefully that's enough to hold that. Now I've turned two little hex nuts. One will go on the top to lock our top bearing, and we'll have to have a washer in here, top and bottom. And that's kind of a little process in and of itself. But anyway, the way this is going to go together is our bearings in there. We'll have a washer, then we'll have a lock nut here. And these have been drilled for a grub screw to hold them on, whether I use a piece of brass as a bearing surface or just don't worry about it and go ahead and solidly anchor it into the threads. I don't know what I'm going to do. Depends on how ambitious I am when I get that far. But anyway, this will slide right up onto here and thread on. And what I'm going to do is mock this up, build my top and bottom mounts, and then I'll go back and start working on the little slinger assembly that's got the bolts sticking out of it. And we're just threading it up to where our keyway is pretty well captured inside our nut, because that's, or inside of the bottom half of the universal joint, because that's about where it's going to end up being. I suppose we could bottom it out and then back it off, or I can see where we're already protruding out. It's going to go just about that far. So that's about where it'll be. Our bearing will fit down onto our bearing surface, and actually we're going to have to raise that a little bit because I had the extra thickness of the belting in here, so this unit will slide on up there. But that's where it goes. This bearing will seat all the way down into the race there, and that is that will be our alignment for that. And any misalignment will be taken up by our universal joint there. So, and we'll see if that's strong enough, if we have to add some extra material, whatever we have to do. Why, we'll deal with that. What I did is I put a couple little flat washers underneath between our machined out portion here and our belting that we've got. Did that top and bottom, so we've got a little more of a standoff and a little spacing, probably not necessary, but we've got it there. I think it'll work fine. So that's pretty much where we're at. I'm going to take and cut some square tubing I've got and use that for our spacers. So we'll do that, and we'll cut our angle iron for along the back of it to support that. Then we can go ahead, align those things, and once we get that done, then we can figure out spacing for the top one, and then we'll have to go back and start machining for the bottom. So let's see if we can't make some more progress. Well, here's pretty much our last view for the day. We're well up into the 90s out here, and it's way too hot to be doing anything. So this is what we're going to end up with. Now this is actually the upper bearing carrier, so it will slide up the shaft and support the first bearing. And this will be welded in place once I make sure of the location. But what's going to happen with it is this one will slide up. The one on the bottom will be a mirror image of this. It'll be flipped over so that bearing will come up from the bottom. But to get to that point, why, we'll have to go ahead and machine our shaft and everything. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got the side panels all made for the lower one. It's just a matter of assembling them and putting the straps across. Now the bottom one I'll probably skeletonize quite a bit more than I have on this one, just because to allow the sand to flow through it a little bit better past it and everything. So otherwise, that's where we're at. This assembly will slide on up into place. I've already had it up here. Tomorrow we'll finish up this part of the shaft and make sure we've got it aligned, get it all welded into place and drilled and bolted into place, because we're going to bolt the cross members in, and that way we can take them off if we want. But we'll do that, and then we'll go ahead and run this motor just to make sure that the wheels on the bus go round and round, type of thing. So hopefully you found this a little bit interesting. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button, and if you hit the bell notification, you'll know when I put out a new video. And any comments or suggestions, leave them in the comment section for me below. And as always, guys, thanks for taking the time to watch.